I'm Sister Rachel Dietz. I am from a little town in Texas called Happy. I grew up the youngest of 9 and went to a public school my whole life until I got into high school. And while I was a youngster, I went to Nazareth, Texas. That's where we went to Mass. And that's where I attended religion classes with Sister Consuela Bauer. I always thought she was such a pretty nun, and I admired her very much. Now, when I was little, I never thought about being a nun. In fact, I didn't think about being a nun until it seemed that God kind of came crashing into my life. I was in the 8th grade in a public school, and I had a boyfriend who played on the basketball team. And of course, I really wanted to go to all the basketball games. Now, in those days, sports events were only held on Friday nights, never during the week because, well, we were supposed to be at home studying during the week. Also, most of us lived on the farm, and so we all had chores to do in the evening after school, so there couldn't be any sports events then. During Lent, in our parish, Stations of the Cross were held every Friday night. It was just assumed that everyone in the parish would attend, and it seems it was close to the same obligation as attending Mass on Sunday. At least it was for our family. It was understood that the whole family would be gathering and piling in the car and going to the Stations of the Cross on Friday night during Lent. Now, I was so taken with my boyfriend, I finally worked up the courage to ask Mom if I could go to the basketball games once in a while instead of going to the Stations of the Cross. Needless to say, that did not go over very well. And then I got a little braver, and I started to bargain with Mom. Could I go to the games instead of Stations of the Cross if I prayed the rosary that day, thinking I could pray it when I got home from the games? Mom seemed to soften a little, but she told me she would have to think about it. Several days later, she came up with her part of the bargain. I could go to the ball games instead of going to Stations of the Cross on Friday night, but I had to get up earlier every day and go to Mass at 7 o'clock before school started at 8. Now, I didn't think that was a very fair deal. 5 mornings at Mass for one short evening of basketball games. But knowing my mom, I knew I had better take this deal or there would be no deal at all. So every morning I rolled out of bed early without her having to call me more than once and went to Mass. Now, when I was at church at Mass, I didn't take a prayer book with me. I didn't take a rosary or a missal, all 3 of which I normally would have taken. Mass was still offered in Latin at the time, and the congregation did usually respond to the Latin, and I had done that. Normally I would have responded. However, I was so angry that Mom had made me go to Mass every day till the end of Lent, and so I would just sit there. I wouldn't participate. Instead, I would think of my friends. I would think of my boyfriend. I would think of what we would do in school all day. I would think about meeting my friends after school at the cafe for a Coke. I did everything I could think of except attend Mass. I didn't go to communion, as I would have already had breakfast, and at that time one needed to be fasting from midnight on to receive communion. Sometimes Mom would insist that I did not eat breakfast and take a jelly bread sandwich along to eat after Mass, so that I could go to communion. About halfway through Lent, as I was sitting there during Mass, the thought suddenly popped into my head, "You should be a nun." Well, the very next thought came from me for sure. "No, God, I don't want to be a nun." And I would work hard not to think about it. However, the more I tried to think about my friends, especially my boyfriend, and our good times and the things we planned to do, the more I thought about that, the more the thought, "God is wanting you to be a nun. You should go to the convent." That kept coming back. Now, I can tell you I didn't share that with anyone. I didn't tell anyone I had the thought, and I sure didn't tell them it didn't go away. I thought it would quit when Easter came and I'd done my Lenten penance, but guess what? It didn't. Now the idea would pop up into my head during class, and it would make me aggravated. Once someone noticed I looked a little dismayed and asked me, "What's wrong?" Of course I said, "Nothing." When I got into high school, my parents wanted me to have a Catholic education. So they decided that I should attend St. Mary's Academy in Amarillo, Texas, which was about 40 miles away from where I lived. I wasn't really too fond of the idea, but I knew how much it meant to my parents. So I was halfway excited and halfway not excited. It meant that I would be living with a Catholic family in Amarillo from Sunday evening to Friday evening, and then I would be at home with my parents and all my friends there, only on weekend. At St. Mary's, it was an all-girls school. Ooh, I didn't particularly like that. I liked having the boys around, but I pretended I was glad. When I would see my friends on the weekend, they would ask me how things were, and I would act like it was really great. Of course, my boyfriend found somebody else, and it didn't take long until I did too. Gradually, I got acquainted with the girls at school. I also got acquainted with the boys who went to the Catholic Boys High School, and found that I was having just as much fun at St. Mary's as I did at Happy, and ended up not going home on weekends lots of times so that I wouldn't miss the parties or sports. But that nagging thought about going to the convent kept poking me. I still never told anyone. I just kept trying to block it out. During my sophomore year at St. Mary's, during a retreat they had for the students each year, one of the talks the priest gave was, "Is God calling you to be a nun?" It aggravated me to think I would have to listen to a talk about being a nun. Wasn't I being poked and urged enough? I asked myself, "God, why would you want me to be a nun? I'm more interested in boys than holiness." You see, I had watched our sisters as they went to communion. I had watched our sisters as they taught us. And I was very impressed with them, their holiness, their dedication. And there was some kind of romantic mystique with the garb and the flowing garbs and that. But I couldn't imagine my doing that. When that retreat was over, I thought surely the whole idea would settle down and go away completely. However, it didn't. In fact, it just got stronger. I finally decided to just surrender and look into what it would mean to be a nun. Of course, I said to myself, they will take one look at me and say, "No, I don't think you would fit in the convent." Eventually, I sent applications to several monasteries. I sent the one to St. Scholastica's because I was acquainted with those sisters. I liked their habit. You notice I was more interested in what their habit looked like than the holiness. I just knew that if I wrote and asked, I would soon get a letter back saying, "Thank you very much for your interest, but you do not qualify." That would get me off the hook, and maybe that nagging thought would just go away. However, the letter came, and I think it said something to the effect, "We are happy that you are interested in being a nun, and enclosed is a list of things you will need to bring with you. 2 pairs of black shoes, 6 pairs of black stockings." The die was cast. It seemed like black was in. Even after entering, I often thought, will they really keep me? And I could tell that in some ways God was working very directly in my life. We studied scripture. We studied the sacraments. I loved it. I got into it. It meant so much to me. Sacraments in the liturgy took on a vibrant meaning. I liked where it seemed God had put me. I've been here for over 50 years. It has not always been easy. In the 70s, many of my friends in the community left the convent, and some of them married. It was a serious and challenging time in religious life. Sometimes I felt lonely and wondered if I was afraid to leave, that I might not be able to support myself. I wondered what my family would think if I left the convent. God and I really got close during those years as I discerned what I would do. I came to believe that indeed I could make it on my own. But something nagged at me, much like nagging I had experienced before I decided to enter the convent. Many changes happened in the church and in religious life during those years. Some I welcomed, some not so welcomed. At one point, I knew I had to make a decision and put the thought behind me. What I didn't realize, the nagging, was that I discovered and came to the realization through a client I was working with at Catholic Family Services, because at this time I was now a clinical social worker. I realized that I was an alcoholic. That was not a pretty thought for me to have. And if that's a shock for you who are listening to this, one of the things that we must remember is that alcohol is a disease and it is no respecter of persons. I went to AA, I got a sponsor, I worked those 12 steps with her. And in working those 12 steps, I came to realize that at the core of me was a spark of the divine, that God wanted me to continue to fan and to flame. The 12-step program is a very spiritual program. And in that program, I became very aware of my potential, the gifts that God has given me. And so many changes from that have happened over the years. Sacraments and Scripture became even more alive after I got sober and was working the 12 steps. That was many years ago. Today, it is a very spiritually enriching life for me, both as a recovering alcoholic and as a nun. Every day I'm called and challenged to grow deeper in my relationship with God, Christ, and Christ present in the sisters with whom I live. Community life provides opportunities for grace and to accept people just as they are, to discover my own gifts and talents, and to be able to use them for the good of the church, for the good of the world. Living in community provides me many opportunities to bump into my own character defects and ask God for the grace to change what I can and leave the rest to God's own discernment. I know that for many years God has been pursuing me. I've realized that. I have come to value that in a very special way. God's love and my friends have carried me through some doubting times. If God has carried me this far, and I am so grateful that He has, I know that He will carry me to the end. I've been living with this community of sisters 59 years, 56 of those in vows. Many changes have happened over the years. Monastic life has been and still is a very spiritually enriching life for me. Every day I am called and challenged to grow deeper in my relationship with God and the Christ present in the sisters with whom I live. Community life provides many opportunities for growing in the relationship with God and the grace to accept people just as they are. Living in community provides me many opportunities to bump into my own defects of character and ask God for the grace to change what I can and leave the rest to God's own discernment. During my years in community, I've been in several different ministries, teaching, religious education, clinical social work, and now I'm doing spiritual direction and spiritual direction training. I have loved all these ministries. Each one has its own challenges, and the rewards far outweigh the challenges. To any young woman who may be sensing a call to the religious life, I want to say, pay attention to that call, that nudge, that poking from God. Let it speak to you. I've discovered that the very point of resistance is where God is most desiring to talk to us and is inviting us into a deeper relationship with Him. Exploring the resistance will lead you to your most authentic self, and that can be so freeing. If my story helps you in your own discernment, I'm grateful. God calls each of us and speaks to each of us in a personal way. God knows your heart, and He loves you uniquely and intensely. Dare to walk and talk with Him. Thank you, and God bless you.